Good evening, everyone. It is presently Wednesday, April 15th, 2020 at 12:52 a.m. Tonight we shall be reading Unintended Consequences by John Ross, Part 2C. This is to be the third video section of Part 2. Part 2C shall be picking up at the end of Chapter 33, Icarus Rising, and beginning with Chapter 34, Lawyer Huntsman, on June 6, 1959, at page 91. So, with that out of the way, let us begin. Unintended Consequences by John Ross. Chapter 34, Lawyer and Huntsman. June 6, 1959. I'm gonna miss hunting with you, Ray. The owner of East Bay Sports smiled as he spoke to his younger friend. Never had a customer before or since that knew as much as you about reading sign, or where the likeliest spot was to find game. East Bay Sports was Gene's attempt to give sportsmen in the Boston area an emporium similar to Abercrombie & Fitch in New York City. He had come pretty close, and Raymond dropped in often when he was free. He liked Gene a lot. When I came here from Colorado in 1955, I was afraid that everything would be so built up there wouldn't be any good hunting at all. Ray grinned at his friend. You're as bad as these folks around here that think everything west of Pennsylvania is a vast wasteland. Gene was originally from New Mexico. He changed the subject. Listen, as a kind of graduation present, if you want anything before you leave, I'll give you 20% off anything in the store. 10 off any guns here on consignment. I gots to make a little something off you, he added with a chuckle. It was well known that the fee for all consignment sales was 20%. That's mighty generous of you, Gene. You sure you want to do that? Your prices have always been very reasonable, at least to my way of thinking. Ray did not like the idea of taking advantage of their friendship for financial gain. The owner shrugged and leaned on the glass-top display case filled with fly-fishing paraphernalia. You taught me a few things these past 4 years about tracking. That knowledge is priceless. Anything you buy, I can replace. Not the stuff on consignment. Hell, that doesn't matter. If it's still in the rack, it's obviously not a real hot item. You got something particular in mind? The older man looked at Raymond with keen interest. Raymond nodded and gave a small smile. I got a little money as a graduation present from my uncle yesterday. I'll take the Holland. A broad smile creased the face of the store owner. Now, why did I have an idea you were going to say that? He walked away from the gun case and over to the picture window in the front of the store. Cradled in a horizontal rack in the center of the display case was a Holland & Holland side-by-side double rifle in caliber .600 nitro. The gun was ornately engraved and weighed 14.5 pounds. Above it was a sign that Gene had made. He had hoped it would help sell the gun. The rifle had been owned by an elderly man who had commissioned it from the famous London gunmakers prior to World War I. He had died 5 months ago, and neither his widow nor his daughter had any attachment to the beautiful rifle. It had been on consignment for 3 months and had failed to attract a buyer. Raymond looked at the large sign. Largest rifle ever made. Holland & Holland 600 Nitro Express. With fitted leather trunk case and 250 rounds of ammunition. $800 US. Gene lifted the rifle out of its stand and handed it to Ray for perhaps the 5th time in 3 months. Raymond threw it up to his shoulder with a fluid motion. His face laid easily on the stock's cheekpiece, and the sights lined up instantly with his right eye. Whoever had this built years ago must have been my size. The stock fits just right. It would be really frustrating if it had too much drop, or some other fault that would be hard to change. Think you'll make it to Africa? Ray shrugged. Someday. Law school comes first. Then I've got to get established. But I think that before I'm 35, I should be able to afford a decent safari. He swung the big rifle up to his shoulder once more, imagining that an angry Cape buffalo was 15 yards in front of the muzzle. Another customer walked over and joined the two men. He was in his 50s and had come in to pick up some 20-gauge shotgun shells. A little too much gun, don't you think? Ray and Gene turned to look at the man. No such thing as too much gun where the game weighs 6 tons and is likely to decide to kill you, Ray said. Gene's sign on the window isn't quite accurate, though. This 600 nitro is the largest modern smokeless powder rifle ever made. But back in the late 1800s, before cordite was invented, the Brits built some much larger black powder rifles. I saw a picture of an 8-bore double rifle once that must have weighed 18 pounds. Ray said easily. The newcomer snorted. You an African hunter, son? The man asked with more than a little scorn. Raymond paused to look the man straight in the eye before replying. Not yet. The man looked slightly chastened and took a different tack. Well, that thing's awfully expensive and heavy. Winchester makes their Model 70 and .458 Magnum now, and it holds 4 shots and probably only weighs half of what that English gun does if you're really serious about hunting big game. And a bolt action will take a lot more pressure than that side-by-side there. The man's confidence level was returning as he continued to talk. Raymond smiled benignly. That's one opinion. The other side to that argument is that high-pressure bolt-action loads can also mean sticky case extraction in an African climate. No big deal if you're shooting a deer 100 yards away. Not the same thing if it's something dangerous at 20 feet. The .458 does duplicate the power of some of the medium-sized English double rifles such as the .450 Nitro, just like you said. No bolt action that I know of, though, will throw a .62 caliber bullet like this rifle will. It has been my experience, on large American game at least, that big heavy bullets kill more reliably and cleanly than smaller ones. I also like the fact that with a double rifle, you essentially have 2 complete rifles and are already loaded. You have a second shot as soon as you can pull the gun down out of recoil, and if something breaks, like a firing pin, you can continue to reload and shoot the remaining good barrel. A broken firing pin in a bolt action in Africa will get you killed. Last of all, and the Winchester rep would shoot me if he was here, the Model 70 is mass-produced for American hunting. 99% of them are .30 caliber or smaller. If they occasionally balk when you work the bolt quickly, which I have had them do, or if they sometimes fail to extract, which I have also had them do, it's a minor irritation for someone on a deer or elk hunt. In Africa, it's a bloody disaster. Winchester went and put a .458 barrel on the same action and the same stock as their .270, and they call it an African hunting rifle. In the 4 years that I've known Gene, he's sent back 3 Model 70s and .375 caliber that split their stocks from recoil. I suspect their new .458 is going to be an even worse warranty problem for Winchester if any customer actually shoots it very much, as anyone serious about hunting in Africa would. He hefted the Holland again and stared at it. This rifle, on the other hand, was designed and built by a company that has supplied professional market hunters in Africa for over a century. I'd feel a lot more confident with it in my hands than a tarted-up deer rifle. Raymond handed the gun to Gene and reached in his pocket for his money clip. He peeled off $800 US and handed the bills to his friend. After a moment's deliberation, he turned back to the other customer. Gene's too polite to say it, but if this was my store and some loudmouth came in and tried to kill a sale on a rifle that cost half as much as a decent car, I'd tell him to go buy his shotgun shells at the local hardware store and never come back. The older man's jaw dropped. Then he turned on his heels without a word and went to the clothing section of the shop. Hey, I'm sorry, Gene. For 4 years I've listened to fools like that give advice when it wasn't warranted, and I'm going home in tomorrow, and I just couldn't help myself. The owner laughed softly. He was biting his lips so that the distant customer couldn't hear. You only said what I wanted to. You got to realize, though, a lot of people operate on envy. Guys like that, he said, nodding towards the back of the store. He would never spend the money to buy a rifle like this, let alone the cost of an African safari, no matter how much he has in the bank. Even if someone gave it all to him, he wouldn't have the nerve to go. A guy like that gets very uncomfortable at the notion of a young fellow like you who intends to make it happen. Makes him feel like going out with his box of skeet shells isn't any fun anymore. Gene's face took on a sad expression. Problem is, he went on, people like him, they get half a chance, they'll do their level best to screw it up for everyone else. You got to watch out for them all the time. Envy and resentment are terrible things. He took the bill to the cash register, rang up $720, added sales tax, and gave Raymond his change. You want all the ammo now? Or should I keep it here until you're about to leave? Keep it, and the rifle too. I'm moving out of my room tomorrow and won't have any place to store it before I go. I'll be by around noon day after tomorrow, if that's okay. I'll be here all day Sunday. I can keep it on layaway for you, no problem." Raymond looked pensive. He chose his next words carefully. "I shouldn't have unloaded on that poor guy. He was just talking. I doubt he cares one way or the other what I or anyone else does with his money. I hope to God you're right. But there's a lot of envy out there. Just hope you never find yourself under the authority of someone with a big dose of it." Raymond Johnson left East Bay Sports and walked to his car. In a few minutes, thoughts of seeing Colorado again would push what Jean had said from his mind. Over 30 years later, however, he would remember his friend's words as clearly as if they had been tattooed on his flesh. This concludes Chapter 34, Lawyer and Huntsman. Also, a brief aside here, the fellow who was acting envious in this chapter would often be referred to as a FUD in today's nomenclature. Anyway, continuing on. Chapter 35. To Wish That She Were Stillborn. June 18th, 1959. It was moments like this that made him wish he had become a dermatologist in California instead of an obstetrician in New York City. He looked down at the pitiful thing to which the Guetterez woman had just given birth. The baby girl's head was unusually small, and only smooth skin was visible where her eyes should have been. He pinched off the umbilical cord and slapped the baby on the back to get her breathing. He wished he hadn't. She made a faint sound, but her lungs did finally start working. The doctor realized immediately that the baby girl was blind and brain damaged, and it filled him with great sadness. He wished her respiratory system were equally defective, to save the family some long-term heartbreak. He'd seen enough babies to know that this one would almost certainly live, if that was indeed the proper term for a body without benefit of a spirit. He looked down at the barely conscious woman on the delivery table, and made a quick decision. "Take over for me here," he instructed the attending nurse. "I need to tell her father." He pulled his mask down and walked out of the delivery room. The young intern watched the tired, hopeful face of Piedro Guetterez collapse when the maintenance man saw the look in his eyes. That day was one of the few that the young doctor truly hated his job. New chapter. Chapter 36. Goodman's 01 and Tinkerer's Tools. June 20th, 1959. The big man and the little boy walked into the showroom on Olive Street, and Henry's jaw dropped. Wow! I've never seen so many guns in one place before, not even at Uncle Max's. In addition to rack upon rack of rifles and rows of glass cases displaying pistols, there was a full-size mounted polar bear standing midway between the front door and the far wall. The walls that did not have gun racks on them were covered with framed photos of men and women. Some were shooting and others were smiling at the camera, kneeling next to game animals. A very pleasant aroma was faintly present also. It reminded Henry of a workshop. "Welcome to Goodman's," said the man behind the counter. He was short and rather pear-shaped, with round glasses, a prominent nose, and curly black hair that was starting to turn gray. "Al, this is my nephew Henry Bowman. He's my sister Catherine's son. He's 6 years old, and his summer vacation just started. Henry, this is Al Goodman. He and my brother Harold own this place." Henry stepped up and shook the man's hand once, using a firm grip as his father had taught him. Al Goodman's handshake felt as if the man were unconscious. "Pleased to meet you," Henry said politely. He could not help looking away from the mild-looking owner and staring at the wealth of fascinating sights throughout the store. Al Goodman had a knowing look on his face. He had seen this happen before. "Is Henry here to get his first rifle?" Al asked mildly. His voice had a nasal quality, but it was not unpleasant. "A rifle?" Henry thought with a start. "That can't be right." "Not just yet," Max answered, "but we'll be back for that before too many more years go by. I thought I'd introduce Henry to this place, and you and Harold, and maybe see if there isn't a pocket knife or two he'd like to have. He also wants to look at a gun he read about if you've got one in the store." "Well, the knives are over here." Al walked to the glass display case at the end of the row, nearest the front window of the store. Henry walked over and peered into it. There were more than 100 different knives, ranging from small folding pen knives to large hunting blades. Henry's eyes were drawn to a massive Bowie knife that was the center of the display case. Its blade gleamed like a mirror. "This is one that every boy should have," said Al in a monotone. pulling a box out of the case and laying it on the glass top. Henry felt mild disappointment at the small size of the box, but he opened it and pulled out a medium-sized folding knife with red sides bearing a white cross. He turned it over in his small hands, examining it. It had several blades folded into it on the one side and a spiral device folded into the other. Swiss Army knife, Al Goodman explained, taking the knife from Henry and opening the main blade and then the smaller blade. Has two sizes of knife blades, one for general cutting and the other for delicate work. He folded them back and opened another blade with his thumbnail. This is a standard-sized screwdriver, and this part, he said, pointing to the curved cutout on the side of the screwdriver blade, is a bottle opener. Henry immediately recognized that it was exactly the right shape to open soft drink bottles, and a huge smile came over his face. Al closed the blade and opened another. This one is a small screwdriver, he said, touching the blade tip, and this part is a can opener. Al continued with his presentation. Here you have a Phillips screwdriver, this is a leather punch, and this curly thing here is a corkscrew for opening wine bottles. You can lend it to your Uncle Max when he gets thirsty. Al added, deadpan. The Bowie knife was forgotten. Henry was enthralled. It will fit in my pocket and I can take it anywhere. Whenever he had sodas outside, people are always looking for the opener. And Dad has to go to the basement whenever he needs a screwdriver upstairs to fix something. Henry imagined reaching into his pocket and pulling out his knife when his father needed to open a soda bottle, or tighten the thing on the screen door that made it close slowly instead of slamming. Henry didn't see Max Collins roll his eyes. Don't you want a real knife like this one here? The big man asked. He pointed to a large, stag-handled folding knife with two blades half opened for display and nickel-silver bolsters on each end. The word case was etched on the larger blade. Al Goodman reached in and withdrew it. He placed it on the glass next to the multifunction tool. Henry stared at the knife. It was very impressive. He licked his lips and looked back at the red pocket knife. Maybe you'd like a larger Swiss Army knife, Al droned, pretending not to notice Max Collins' pained expression. Larger? Henry said reflexively. The store owner withdrew another cardboard box from the case and opened it. He handed Henry a knife similar to the first one, but twice as thick. This is our biggest model. It has all the blades I showed you before, and also some others. He opened one, and since it was obviously a tiny pair of scissors, he did not bother to explain. This one here, he continued, opening a new blade, is for scaling fish. Henry had never been fishing, and so he remained silent. This one, Al went on, is a wood saw, and this one is both a metal file and a metal saw that will cut through steel if you keep at it. His tone of voice was the same as if he were reading the telephone directory. Henry was transfixed. A saw that will cut through wood, and another for steel. Henry realized Al was explaining again. This is a toothpick, which is kind of pointless, I think, but the thing that slides out of this side is a smaller pair of tweezers, and they can come in handy when you get a splinter. Henry Bowman's eyes were wide as he stared at the amazing knife. Which one do you like best? Al asked finally. Henry's gaze went back to the beautiful two-bladed case knife, and he bit his lip. He knew he would not use it or carry it as much, but he would love to own it. What the hell are you giving the kid a hard time for, Al? Max demanded. He obviously likes both of them, or have your eyes really gotten that bad? Maybe you should let Harold run the sales floor from now on, eh? Al Goodman looked up and saw the big man grinning at him. The store owner had never pushed a sale on Max Collins in the 12 years they had known each other. Max, in turn, had accounted for more business than any other individual customer. The Goodman brothers kept very meticulous records of things like that. I'll pull both of these aside for you, Al told Henry. Over here by the register so that you and your Uncle Max can look around the rest of the store. He scooped up the bigger Swiss Army knife and the two-bladed case and walked over to the cash register. Max walked over to a display case in front of a rack of fine shotguns. Henry followed his uncle, but his mind was elsewhere. He was having a hard time believing the good fortune which had just befallen him. Hey Al, let me see that Model 12 pigeon gun. The short man handed Max Collins the pump shotgun. Its receiver was ornately engraved. Max opened the action to make sure the chamber was empty and threw the gun up to his shoulder. Decent rib pitch, and the comb's about right, he pronounced. I've been using a double, but the patterns aren't exactly matching. After watching Herb, I think a pump may be even faster since your left hand will pull it out of recoil. He laid the shotgun down on a rectangular pad on top of the display case and squatted down next to his nephew. You see that picture there? Max said, pointing across the room. Henry nodded. That there's Herb Parsons. He's an exhibition shooter who works for Winchester. He can hit 7 clay birds with 7 shots before they hit the ground, all thrown in the air at the same time, using a gun just like this one. He's doing it right there. Henry examined the photo. A man with his back to the camera had a shotgun pressed to his shoulder. There were 5 black puffs of smoke hanging in the sky and 2 clayed birds about to be hit. A Model 12 will fire as soon as the action closes, if you've got the trigger held down, Max explained. Slam fire, they call it. Not all pump shotguns will do that, because most of them use a disconnector. If a man practices enough, he can shoot a Model 12 accurately, even faster than an automatic. Herb will be at the range next month. We'll go shooting out there and you can meet him. Max stood up and turned to Al Goodman. We'll take this one too. I'm going to see if I can learn to shoot it the way he does. If not, I'll trade it back for something else. Henry stared at the photo for a few moments longer, then remembered the thing he had intended to ask. Do you have a 4-bore here? He asked the older man. Al Goodman was startled at the 6-year-old's question, but he answered immediately in his trademark nasal monotone. It's illegal to hunt birds in the United States with any shotgun larger than a 10-gauge. Has been for 50 years or so. I'm afraid you hardly ever see those big old wildfowl guns anymore, except in museums and once in a while in a private collection. He turned to Henry's uncle. Does he understand the way the gauge system works? As a matter of fact, he does, Max answered, nodding. The day that Walter had given Henry the Guinness Book, he had explained to his son that shotgun bores were sized based on how many pure lead balls exactly the diameter of the bore would equal 1 pound. Thus, a 20-gauge had a bore the diameter of a pure lead ball that weighed 1/20th of a pound, or approximately 0.61 inches. And a 12-gauge gun had a bore the size of a pure lead ball that weighed 1/12th of a pound, which measured approximately 0.722 inches. The smaller the number of the gauge, the bigger the gun. Max had been surprised on the drive over to the store that the boy understood this system of measurement. Not a shotgun, Henry broke in. A 4-bore rifle. A double barrel. Really heavy. About 25 pounds. Al Goodman opened his mouth and was about to tell the 6-year-old that such a rifle did not exist, but he paused before speaking. Gun shops tended to attract people who possessed tremendous amounts of misinformation about firearms, and Al and Harold both put up with the ridiculous questions each business day. They had an ironclad rule never to embarrass or shame a customer, no matter how stupid his claim. And Al was not going to break that rule just because the customer was a 6-year-old boy. Furthermore, to Al Goodman's knowledge, Max Collins had never uttered a single wrong statement about firearms, and he noticed Max wasn't correcting his nephew now. Al closed his mouth and revised what he was about to say. I have never personally seen a 4-gauge rifle, Henry. Either single or double barrel. Did you see a picture of one somewhere? Henry shook his head. I just read about it. Al Goodman nodded. He was imagining a piece of fiction in a Real Guts type magazine, but what Max said next caused him to reverse his thinking once again. Saw an 8-bore double rifle once out in Vegas, Max said. Under-lever hammer gun with nice engraving. Huge goddamn thing. Must have weighed over 16 pounds. Took a big brass case about 3.5–4 inches long with a cast lead bullet in the end as big as your thumb. Guy from California had it. Wasn't looking to sell. He'd taken it to Africa and killed a buffalo with it, and I think he wanted to show the thing off. Said it was made about 1890. Al Goodman looked at the boy with new respect. Where did you read about this 4-bore rifle, Henry? In the Guinness Book of World Records, sir, he replied immediately. Al nodded again. Always learn something new from my customers. Henry felt flattered at the comment. I'm afraid we don't have either a 4-bore or an 8-bore rifle here right now, but we do get a lot of guns in every week. I'll tell Harold to keep his eyes out, and we'll call your Uncle Max if one comes in. Wouldn't surprise me if he bought it on the spot, Al added in his monotone. Goodman's for Guns was arguably the finest gun store in the Midwest. Its owners, ironically, had no interest whatsoever in either shooting, hunting, or owning fine firearms. They had a very keen interest in making money, however, and it was their insight in attracting and pleasing good customers who did love fine firearms that was the foundation of their success as a business. As it turned out, though, the Goodman brothers never would see a 4-bore rifle come into their store. None of the three there that day knew it, but there were fewer than 15 of the massive guns in existence in the entire country. Henry's learned a lot from the Guinness Book, Max explained to Al. His father gave it to him a couple of weeks ago, and I think he's read it cover to cover by now. If Henry likes to read, maybe he'd like this year's Gun Digest. It's got a lot of interesting articles in it. The way Al said it, he might as well have been reciting a recipe for meatloaf. He reached up to the shelf and took down a large softcover book about an inch thick. The Gun Digest came out annually. Al Goodman had himself never read a single article in it, but customers bought a lot of them, and were forever quoting from it. He handed the book to the boy. Henry looked at the cover. It was a color drawing of the strangest-looking pistol Henry had ever seen, lying on top of a wooden bench with 5 paper targets standing in the distance. He opened the cover and found the table of contents. He was looking at the articles listed in the left-hand column when 2/3 of the way down a title leapt out at him. Ed McGivern, Fastest, Fanciest Six-Gunner, by Chad Wallen, page 80. Ed McGivern! Henry exclaimed, turning quickly to page 80. You know who Ed McGivern was? His uncle asked in surprise. Henry nodded. He died a year ago last December, Max added. Al Goodman knitted his eyebrows together. He had never heard of the man. He could fire a revolver 5 times in less than a half-second, Henry said with confidence. Al opened his mouth to comment on this obvious exaggeration when Max Collins spoke again. Damn right he could. I saw him do it myself at the Montana State Fair almost 30 years ago. I think it may have been even faster than that, to tell you the truth. Sounded like one quick roar. Faster than the Tommy guns I shot in the Army. But Jesus, you should have seen him shoot things in the air. Marbles, washers with paper pasted over the hole, clay birds, 2 guns at once. I never would have believed it if I hadn't seen him do it myself. You mean like this? Henry held the book open. On the left-hand page was a photo very similar to the one on the wall of Herb Parsons, except the man doing the shooting was holding a revolver instead of a shotgun, and there were 5 black puffs of smoke in the air instead of 7. Well, I'll be dipped in shit. I saw him do that, by God. There it is, Central Montana State Fair in 1931. I had a job on a cattle ranch that summer after high school, and we went to the fair one weekend, and damned if Ed McGivern wasn't there in the flesh and blood. Never saw anything like it. He looked at his nephew with interest. You really do like to read, don't you? He asked the little boy. Henry nodded. I've got Ed McGivern's book at home, you know. Tells all about how he trained himself to do all the things he did. He looked at the store owner. Say, Al, do you have a copy of Fast and Fancy Revolver Shooting here? The owner shook his head. Hell, kid, I'll let you have mine. He turned to Al Goodman. Put the Gun Digest on my tab, too. The big man turned to his nephew. You ready to go? Henry glanced over to his right. Max Collins had a knowing smile on his face when he asked the next question. You want to go over and look at the bear while I see if Al's got anything else for me to take home? A huge grin appeared on Henry's face, and he ran over to where the mounted polar bear stood. As he did so, the door to the store opened, and in walked a slender man of about 35. He was carrying a long gun under his arm. It had 2 shotgun barrels side by side, with a rifle barrel underneath. The owner looked up and acknowledged him as he walked over. Good morning, Major. Mornin', Al. Thought I'd see what you'd give me for this German drilling, the man said, using the correct term for the hybrid sporting arm. Al Goodman took the gun from the younger man and opened it, looking down the bore of the rifle barrel. The newcomer continued. Picked it up during the war. Hardly ever been shot at all. It's the tightest action you ever seen, though. 16 gauge over 8x57 mm Mauser. Balances beautifully, and can take any kind of game on the continent. Gorgeous engraving, too. And look at that wood! Al examined the Tushonic engraving on the metal, and the deep relief carving on the wood. He had never liked carving, and much preferred standard checkering himself, to the extent that he cared at all. He was evaluating the gun, trying to decide what a customer might pay for it. He knew that Max Collins thought combination guns were for fools. Before he could say anything, though, the young man finished his sales pitch with what he believed to be the clincher. And what's more, this was the personal weapon of Hermann Göring. Al Goodman looked up to his customer, who was grinning broadly. Well, of course, that would endear it to me. Al's face and voice, as always, were both entirely devoid of emotion or inflection. Al was wearing an open-necked shirt, and a Jewish mezuzah hung around his neck. The army major either didn't see it or didn't care. I can't give you a price until Harold sees it, and he doesn't usually work on Saturdays. You can leave it here and I'll call you Monday, or you can bring it back any time during the week. Hang on to it, the man said airily. I'm going to see what you've gotten in lately in your pistol case. He moved away from Al and Max towards the far end of the store. Max Collins reached into his pocket and leaned over to whisper to the smaller man, Al, I'll give you $100 right now if you call that guy back over and say, Sir, I've considered this very carefully, and I'll give you $20 for that gun. For the first time that day, Al Goodmans smiled. Even if Max Collins had not been Goodman's best customer, he would still have been Al's favorite customer. The store owner had no doubt whatsoever that Max Collins would carry through on his offer, and be mighty glad to do so. I'd do it for nothing, Max, but he's a good customer. Just a little slow, that's all. Max Collins shook his head and clenched his teeth to keep himself from breaking out laughing. He laid $300 bills next to the cash register, and Al Goodman rang up his sale. All set, kid? He called out as Al handed him his change and the shotgun. Henry came running over, and Al held out a sack containing the boy's gun digest and his 2 pocket knives. Thank you, sir, Henry said solemnly. Now let's get you home so you can fool with that pocket tool of yours and read up on Ed McGivern, eh? The big man and the little boy walked towards the door. As he was about to exit the gun shop, Henry Bowman looked over his shoulder and called out to the owner. I really like your store, you know. Well, thank you, Henry, replied the proprietor. Al Goodman smiled for the second time that day. It was a record for him. This ends Chapter 36, Goodman's 01 and Tinkerer's Tools. Chapter 37, Bossing and Broken Windows. January 6th, 1961. Hey! The man yelled out across the office, his hand covering the mouthpiece of the telephone he held. Wagner just had a heart attack. DOA at Barnes. We've got to move fast. The vultures will be circling. His partner sat bolt upright. His mind was racing, and he was already thinking several steps ahead of the necessary special edition that would be held to replace the dead legislator. Shit! On the first week of the session, for Christ's sake, what the fuck? If Holmes and Armitage get into it, they'll be at each other's throats the whole fucking time. They hate each other, and the last thing we need is a mud bath between these two fighting for Wagner's seat. It might even throw it to the Republicans. God forbid, the first man warned. The second man grimaced with distaste at this last thought. There had never been a Republican state representative in his district during his lifetime. He intended to do his part to see that it stayed that way. Well, we can't have that, he said, shaking his head. What we need is someone everyone can live with. Belson? Nah, too young. We need someone older, that the unions can go for. Andrews? He shook his head. Maybe, but a lot of people see him as mean-spirited. You won't get Holmes or Armitage to step aside for that guy. His friend nodded in agreement. How about Joe Hammond? Joe Hammond, eh? He said the name slowly as he mulled it over in his mind. He hadn't thought of Joe, but the suggestion had a certain logic to it. His friend held up his left fist as he started to enumerate points by raising fingers one at a time. He's 60 or thereabouts, made a pile in construction, and always used only union labor. I never heard of him screwing anyone in a deal, and the only people who don't like him are the ones who resent him for being a success when they weren't. He's given a lot of dough to the party over the years, and I think he's ready to get out of his business. We might sell that. His wheels were turning. Think he'd want it? The other man shrugged. Hell, can't tell till we ask him. Decent chance, though, if you ask me. Political power can be pretty attractive, particularly if getting it's painless. You know anyone who'd turn it down? Not many, to be honest. Particularly if they're already about to get out of whatever they're doing. Let's run it by Harris and Fields, and then let's meet with Joe Hammond. The State House representative for the 92nd District of Missouri in St. Louis had just been decided. New chapter here. Chapter 38. Goodman's 02 and a Boy's First Rifle. January 14th, 1961. Henry Bowman was as excited as he could ever remember being. This was even better than the last time he'd been to Goodman's a year and a half before. As he and his father walked through the door, he smelled the faint aroma of Hops No. 9 bore solvent. It was very pleasant, and it brought the memory of his first visit to the store into brilliant focus in his mind. "Mr. Goodman? Walter Bowman. Good to see you again. I understand you've already met my son, although it was a couple of years ago. The 10th was his 8th birthday, and we're here to get his first rifle." He held out his hand to the older man, who took it in a lifeless grip. "Please, it's Al. Your son made quite an impression on us when he and his uncle came in last. He's quite a reader, as I recall, and I learned a few things from him. Tell me, Henry, are you still looking for a 4-bore rifle?" "Do you have one here?" Henry asked immediately with unconcealable excitement. "No," replied Al Goodman, shaking his head and putting a sad expression on his face. "I'm afraid we've never had one come in. I found out that they're terribly rare, and the few that do exist are mostly in Europe. But I did find a book by a man that used a 4-bore rifle in Africa, and I also have a photo of one." He walked over to a shelf and took down a copy of Wild Beasts and Their Ways by Sir Samuel White Baker. This man hunted all over Africa with some very large rifles about 100 years ago. You're welcome to borrow this book and read about him. Al Goodman opened the cover and withdrew a photograph. "This is a photograph from a store in England that sells fine guns." He handed the photo to the boy. Henry stared down at the picture. 2 guns were lying on a tabletop. The first was of normal size and appeared to be a double-barrel shotgun with fine engraving. The gun below it was slightly shorter in length, but massive in its construction. The barrels were twice as thick, and the huge receiver had a pair of exposed hammers above the breech. The engraving was of even higher quality than that of the smaller weapon. I promised to return the picture, but I told the owner I had a friend who would like to look at it, and he let me keep it until you had a chance to come in. Walter Bowman smiled at the older man's characterization of 8-year-old Henry as his friend. He told me the 4-bore weighs 24 pounds empty and 25.5 pounds loaded. Al turned to Henry's father. "I've been in this business for 30 years, and your son told me about a rifle I had never even heard of. It wasn't until last month that I even saw a picture of one." Walter Bowman looked with great pride at his son, who was staring intently at the photograph. Henry is very good at learning all there is to know about subjects that interest him. "Has he told you what kind of rifle he wants?" "As a matter of fact, no, he hasn't. I thought we'd get your suggestions, and then maybe Henry will be able to pick one out." Al Goodman nodded, but he wasn't learning what he really needed to know, which was how much Walter Bowman was willing to pay for his son's first .22. A Marlin single-shot bolt-action .22 with birch stock retailed for $17.25 US. By comparison, a Browning auto-loading .22 with a beautifully figured French walnut stock and grade 3 factory engraving retailed for $159.50 US. The recently discontinued Winchester 52 Sporter bolt-action was the same size and quality as their Model 70 centerfire, and had sold for $200 US. Al Goodman would have been amazed if Walter Bowman intended to buy either of the last 2 rifles for his son. Most fathers bought the cheapest single shot available for their son's first rifle, for children were not always good at taking care of valuable equipment. The same was true of some adults, and Al recalled the condition of some of the used guns that people brought into the store. Assuming that a customer was going to want the least expensive choice, however, was not how Goodman's had become such a great success. Walter Bowman's next comment clarified things considerably for the store owner. "He probably needs a repeater. I think it's a foregone conclusion that Henry's going to do a lot of shooting. We spend each summer in the country on the Mississippi River, and he can shoot every day there if he wants to. I don't think we want a rifle for formal competition shooting at paper targets. It's my understanding that they're rather heavy, and I think Henry's more interested in shooting sticks floating down the river right about now." He looked over at his son, who was nodding agreement. "Also, I'd like him to have something of good quality. I don't know much about guns, but I believe in good tools that will last a lifetime. Henry's Uncle Max shoots guns that his father gave him almost 40 years ago. I think Henry's first rifle should be something that he'd still be proud to own even after he's grown." Al Goodman nodded sagely. "I can show you a few choices. Is it fair to say that if they're all in about the same price range, the one that feels the best for Henry is probably going to be the one you want?" "Yes, I think so." Walter Bowman suppressed a grin as he watched the least enthusiastic sales technique he had ever seen. In that case, if you want a repeater for doing a lot of shooting, one with a tubular magazine is easiest to load and holds the most cartridges. You won't have a separate box magazine or clip that can be misplaced or get separated from the gun. Some rifles have their tubular magazines under the barrel, and some have them in the buttstock, but they both work the same way. Do you know if you are interested in a bolt action, a lever action, a pump, or a semi-auto? The two men looked at Henry. If it's okay, Dad, I'm pretty sure I want a pump or an autoloader. Henry did not say so, but he knew exactly what he wanted. He wanted either a Winchester Model 61 pump, or, if he could really have any rifle at all, he wanted a Winchester Model 63 semi-auto. Henry had seen Herb Parsons use both of these guns 18 months before at the Olin Range in Alton, Illinois with his Uncle Max. With the pump gun, Parsons had turned the rifle on its side and held it at chest level. He worked the action briskly to eject the fired case vertically into the air. Then he had snapped the rifle up to his shoulder and hit the airborne empty casing with the next shot. He had repeated this procedure until the gun was empty. With the Model 63, he had hit 3 eggs thrown in the air at the same time with 3 shots. Henry did not think he would ever be able to hit fired .22 cases in the air, but he thought he might learn to hit a tossed hen's egg. Herb Parsons had also told him that each of the 2 guns had over 100,000 rounds fired through them, and that if they ever broke just from shooting, Winchester would fix them for free. Henry had been impressed. When Henry had done research in his 1959 Gun Digest, he had discovered that the Winchester 63 was the most expensive .22 ever made, not counting special target rifles and guns that were engraved. It sold for a few cents under $80. Other pumps and semi-autos sold for less than half that amount, and the price on the Winchester has probably gone up in the last 2 years, he thought dismally. Remington and Winchester both made good pumps and autos, and Browning makes a nice auto but no pump. The short man gently lifted 2 rifles from the rack. For customers interested in guns of lasting value, we suggest sticking to those 3 makes, at least as far as .22s are concerned. He laid the 2 rifles on the padded counter. In the slide action, Remington makes the .572 and Winchester makes the .61. The Remington comes in 2 versions, either a steel receiver or an aluminum one for a bit more money. The aluminum receiver gun is lighter, has a chrome-plated magazine tube, and an aluminum cover on the barrel. Some people like the lighter weight, but neither gun is overly heavy. The one here is steel, but I can show you the aluminum model also. It comes in different colors. Al Goodman did not think Mr. Bowman would think much of an anodized aluminum rifle. I can imagine what my brother-in-law would say if we brought home something like that. I thought you were going to Goodman's, not a goddamn whorehouse. Al Goodman laughed at Walter's startlingly accurate impression of Max Collins. Henry looked at the 2 men, and they both motioned for him to pick up one of the rifles. Press this small lever with your trigger finger and work the slide with your opposite hand to make sure the gun is empty, Al instructed. Henry did so, and then closed the action and threw the rifle up to his shoulder, aiming at a spot on the wall well away from any people in the store. The stock was large for him, as almost any stock would be for an 8-year-old, but his position was right and the sights lined up with his right eye. Try the Winchester next. Henry repeated the procedure and realized that the second gun's stock and forend were slightly smaller and were easier for his hands to grip comfortably. This one feels better, especially in my left hand. Winchester makes their stocks a little slimmer, and they groove the forend deeply to give a good grip when you're working the action. Remington made their guns look like one of their centerfires, but it doesn't seem to handle as nicely for most people as the Winchester. Al put the Remington back in the rack and withdrew 2 more rifles, laying them next to the Winchester pump. In terms of semi-autos, you have more choices. Al went on in his expressionless voice. Remington makes 3. These 2, the Model 550 and 552, are somewhat similar. The 552 is newer and is designed to look like one of their deer rifles. It has a few aluminum parts and weighs a few ounces less than the 550. This one, he continued, lifting a 3rd rifle from the rack, is their newest model. It's called the Nylon 66. The entire one-piece stock is made of DuPont brand nylon, and that's what all the pins ride on. It's not very pretty, but it works well. Remington advises you could drive a truck over it and it'll still work, though I wouldn't try it, personally. Al looked up at Walter Bowman. I'm not aware that any of our customers make a habit of driving over their guns, but perhaps Remington has found an untapped segment of the market." Walter smiled at Al's deadpan humor. Henry looked at the rifle. The brown plastic stock was exceedingly ugly. He had read of how a shooter named Tom Fry had been hired by Remington and had used 2 of the guns in late 1959, soon after they were first introduced. He had hit 100,000 wooden blocks thrown in the air, missing only 6. Fry had broken Ad Toppervine's 50-year-old record, but it was not an exact comparison. Toppervine had adhered to the old rules where the targets were thrown 20 or more feet vertically by a person standing at least 25 feet in front of the shooter. Fry, by contrast, had had his throwers stand right by his shoulder and thrown the wooden blocks along the intended path of the bullet. Henry picked up the rifle, checked the chamber, and threw it to his shoulder. It was light and balanced well enough, but he hated the feel of the cold plastic. He tried the other 2 Remingtons, and although the wood felt better in his hands, the guns did not seem to fall into place as had the Winchester pump gun. He laid each rifle back on the counter and looked at his father. "Dad, I'd rather not have a rifle with a plastic stock, if that's okay. I don't care how strong it is." "Huh. I guess all that time spent with me in the shop rubbed off on you, eh? Al, put that nylon one away. Anything else we should look at?" Yes. The Winchester 77 and the Browning. The Winchester doesn't have a tubular magazine, but if you don't mind loading a box magazine with a clip, it's a fine rifle. Here, let me show you one." Al Goodman carried the nylon 66 back to the rack and returned with the Winchester in his left hand and the Browning in his right. He handed the Winchester to the boy. Henry looked at it carefully and opened the action, then threw it up to his shoulder. He laid it down next to the other 3 rifles. He had a look of concentration on his face as he stared at the 4 guns. Then he looked back at the store owner, who handed him the Browning autoloader. It was the most finely finished of all the rifles there, and the grain of the wood was very handsome. The very slender receiver necessitated a swelled shape for the fore-end, which Henry thought was vaguely strange-looking. It handled beautifully, though. Henry was well aware that it was the most expensive rifle in the group, and he had hoped he would not like it as much. He did not wish for his father to think he wanted it solely based on its price. "Well, what you think, son?" "Let me try them again." Henry Bowman snapped each rifle into position quickly, one after the other. When he had laid the 5th one down, he looked at his father, and then at Al Goodman. He felt awkward with what he was about to say. He didn't know if it would sound stupid. "The sights on the Winchester pump line up the quickest with my eye, and the Browning auto is almost as good. For the other 3, though, it seems like I have to squash my face down on the stock a little to line up the sights." "How observant of you," Al Goodman said. "Your son is exactly right," Al Goodman said to Walter Bowman. "The Winchester and the Browning are the oldest designs here. The others you've seen were brought out in more recent years since scope sights became affordable and more people wanted them, even on 22s. Their stocks are shaped to hold your head higher up, in line with where a scope would be. You see these grooves here?" Al asked, indicating 2 parallel channels milled into the top of the Remington. "These grooves are for mounting a lightweight scope for a 22 caliber rifle. The Winchester pump doesn't have them. The Browning does, but the factory has only recently started putting them on, and they didn't change the stock dimensions from the original." He looked Henry's father in the eye. "Is your son this observant about everything?" The father smiled, beaming. "About things that interest him, yes. Always." "Are you planning on using a scope for your rifle, Henry?" The way Al said it, Walter Bowman imagined he was hearing a recording on the telephone. "No, sir. I want to hit targets in the air like Herb Parsons and Ed McGivern." Walter Bowman was momentarily embarrassed and started to say something, but Al was talking again. "If you're serious about trick shooting, either of the 2 guns would work, but with a low recoil gun like a 22, the semi-auto would prove better." He looked at Walter Bowman. "You should know that all the other rifles are between $50 and $55. The Browning is $70. Walter Bowman was no stranger to fine craftsmanship, and he waved his hand in dismissal. "It looks well worth an extra $15. He turned to his son. "Shall we take it home?" Henry smiled, but he had an anxious look on his face. He turned to the mild-looking owner of the gun store. "Do you have a Winchester Model 63? Al Goodman shook his head. "Winchester stopped making the 63 last year. It wasn't selling well because it was a more expensive gun to make than their competitions." Al squinted and continued. Now, I do have a used one that was part of an estate collection, but it's about 25 years old. Can I see it? Henry asked immediately. He did not know what an estate was, and he did not particularly care. Of course. Al Goodman walked 20 feet over to the used gun section of the store and withdrew a rifle from the back row of the case. He brought it over and handed it to the boy. It had a tubular magazine which was filled through an oval port on the right side of the stock, just like the Browning. Unlike the Belgian gun, however, the Winchester had a taller receiver and the contours of the wooden forend blended smoothly into it. The bluing was worn from all the sharp corners of the receiver, and bare metal shone through. The same was true of the muzzle. The gun was well oiled, and no hint of rust or corrosion was evident anywhere on it. The grip section of the stock and the center of the forend had a different sheen to them than did the rest of the wood. Walter Bowman recognized instantly the signs of wood that had been long exposed to the polishing effects of human hands. Henry threw the rifle up to his shoulder, and a huge smile split his face. The sights fell in line the instant his cheek hit the stock. The rifle felt like it was a part of him. "This is my favorite, Dad," he said immediately, and handed the gun to his father. "It looks like it's been well cared for by someone who used it quite a lot," Walter Bowman said to the older man as he examined the rifle. "Is the bore in good shape?" He was no firearms expert, but he knew enough to ask about that. 22s will virtually never wear out a bore from shooting, but any obstruction can ruin the barrel if a shot is fired through it, and unlike a center fire, you usually can't see the damage from the outside. 22s get shot so much there's a real risk with a used one, and we see our share of jugged barrels. We don't accept those, either in trade or in consignment, for obvious reasons. You're right about the owner, though. He shot this gun quite a lot in the last 25 years, but he never shot bad ammo that left a bullet in the bore, or accidentally poked the muzzle in the dirt. You may have known him. Name of Hamilton. He passed away last month. His widow brought in his entire collection to sell off. Al Goodman remembered Walter's question about the rifle and added, "I'll be glad to get you a bore scope and let you examine it yourself if you'd like. But we both know Henry's uncle would skin me alive if I sold you a rifle with a bum barrel. Do you think a semi-auto is a good choice for an 8-year-old? Another good question. Ordinarily we recommend a single shot as a first rifle for young boys because you have to manually operate the action and insert a new cartridge between shots. Most people think any manually operated repeater is safer than a semi-auto for first-time shooters. But the fact is that anyone who shoots much gets into the habit of working the action immediately after firing a shot so that the gun is ready to fire again. That's true for a bolt action, lever action, or a pump. Your son has demonstrated impeccable safety habits here today, and I think he will be equally safe with any of the rifles we've looked at if you or his uncle gets him started with his new rifle. Walter Bowman looked at his son and held out the Winchester. "This is the one you want, kiddo?" Henry nodded eagerly, and Walter turned to the older man. "We'll take it, Mr. Goodman." Al Goodman liked customers who didn't haggle over prices, but he wasn't used to ones who didn't even look at the price tag. The Goodman brothers had enough finances that they could buy large collections outright from heirs eager to get cash. They always tried to buy estate collections for less than a third of what the guns cost new. Used guns had more profit margin in them than new ones, and thus more room for negotiation. The Goodmans also liked to have a new customer eager to return. Al looked at the price tag on the rifle and mentally subtracted $5. That gun is 25 years old, and the finish is worn. The last list price on a Model 63 was $80. I can let you have that rifle, along with a soft case so it won't get scratched, for $45. How does that sound? It sounds like we'll be able to afford quite a bit of ammo. Any recommendations? Winchester Super Speed is good. The bullets are copper-plated so they won't leave lead in the bore even with lots of shooting. And they don't have a waxy lubricant that some companies use which picks up dirt. 78 cents per 50-round box. How many boxes would you like? We'll take a case. A full case is 100 boxes. 10 10-box cartons, 5,000 rounds for $66. Can you use that many right away, or do you want to start with less? Walter Bowman had thought that a case of 22 rimfire was 2,500 cartridges, but he nodded at the salesman anyway. "I think we'll take a full case, if that won't clean you out. Saves us from having to run back here right away." "Of course, sir. I'll have the stock boy bring one out for you." Al Goodman rang up the sale, and Walter Bowman paid him with $20 bills and collected his change. $100 was a lot to spend on an 8-year-old, but Henry had not wanted toys that would soon be forgotten, and his birthday was so close to Christmas that in previous years his parents had only given him a cake and a few knickknacks. "Might take you a long time to shoot all this up," the teenage stockboy said as he met them in the front of the store. Walter lifted the heavy carton onto his right shoulder and took his son's hand with his left. The two of them walked towards the car, with Henry carrying his rifle in the soft cloth case in the crook of his left arm. "I'll come back for more when it's gone," Henry replied cheerfully. The teenage stalker, a small-bore competitor who practiced on an indoor range every day, smiled broadly. It made him feel good to see a little boy with his first rifle. If Henry Bowman had chosen any of the other guns he had seen that afternoon on his 8th birthday, he would probably never have become aware of a quirk that was peculiar to Winchester Model 63 rifles. He definitely would not have discovered this quirk at the age of 8, when his interest in shooting was beginning to seriously accelerate and his own preferences were crystallizing. Henry did go home that day with the Model 63, however, and his choice would prove to have powerful repercussions that would not ultimately be felt until long after he had become an adult. As it turned out, it did take Henry Bowman longer than he expected to shoot up all 5,000 rounds of his birthday ammunition. It was winter, and he and his parents only went to their place in the country on Saturdays. Henry and his father would not return to Goodmans for more ammunition for almost 2 months. New chapter here. Chapter 39. The Contract Law Student and Huntsman. April 7th, 1961. Mr. Johnson, most law professors here at Harvard, myself included, have a reputation for criticizing often and praising almost never. We do that so that students will not become complacent. Your work in my contracts class has been uniformly excellent, and I am strongly recommending your work for publication in the Law Review Journal. Although I suspect you will be successful in whatever area of the law you choose to pursue, I suggest you give serious thought to working on Wall Street. They have always needed top-flight contract specialists, but even more so now with the Kennedy administration's apparent pro-business stance. I would not be surprised to see a substantial increase in both the required level of excellence of securities contracts lawyers and in their compensation as well. If you are interested, I may be able to assist you in getting a summer internship at Lambert Burns in New York. I still have a little influence there. Raymond Johnson sat up a little straighter. Lambert Burns was a powerhouse law firm on Wall Street, and Professor Dobbs was not known for making idle promises. That's mighty generous of you, sir. I have 2 offers for internships right now, but neither one of them is as appealing as a summer at Lambert Burns. You realize there won't be much chance to go hunting if you spend the summer in New York City. Dobbs was exhibiting a rare smile as he said this. It had become common knowledge on campus that while all the other male students at Harvard Law School were using what little spare time they had to pursue Radcliffe undergrads, the Colorado native was apt to be out in the woods an hour west of Boston with a small game rifle. Upstate New York's got some decent hunting, sir. I might be able to get off some Saturday afternoon. He smiled when he said this. Both Ray and the professor knew full well that the pace Lambert Burns set for its summer interns was apt to be even more rigorous than that of law school. For your sake, I hope you're right. In any case, I'll make some calls and see what I can do about getting you in with them. They'd be missing a bet if they didn't make you an offer. Listen, the older man said, changing the subject. I've got papers to grade, and you've got cases to prepare. I'll call you in again when there's more to tell. Yes, sir. I appreciate that, sir, Raymond said as he stood up to go. I'm glad you think enough of my work to do this for me. It's part of my job. Not many people know it, that's all. He turned his attention to a stack of papers on his desk. Well, some days you win, as Dad always says, Raymond thought as he closed the office door behind him. Law Review. Not bad. As he left the building, he decided to go by East Bay Sports and see his friend Gene. New chapter here. Chapter 40. At Intersections, Griffin and HOWE, and Gun Culture Guangxi. Yes, I wrote that title myself. That is not original to speak of. August 12th, 1961. Yes, sir. How can we help you today? The proprietor smiled and faced the young man who had just entered the storefront in New York City. Raymond Johnson looked at the man and smiled back. Been planning to come here ever since I got to New York in the beginning of the summer. But this is the first Saturday I haven't had to work. He walked over to the older man with his hand extended. but could not resist staring around the room. "Ray Johnson," he said immediately, recognizing the man from photos he had seen. "I've wanted to see what Griffin and Howe looked like ever since I was a kid out in Colorado." "I hope we don't disappoint you, Mr. Johnson," the man said wryly. "Not likely," Ray said immediately as he continued to take in the rack upon rack of beautifully finished rifles that covered the walls. He lowered his gaze to the glass case that stood waist-high in front of him. Inside it were several of the handmade, steel, quick-detachable scope mounts for which Griffin and Howe was internationally known. "I should warn you that I'm not in much of a position to buy one of your custom rifles right now, but it's likely I'll be moving permanently to New York in a year, and my finances are apt to improve, assuming I pass the bar." "Law student, eh?" "Yeah, that's right. I start my 3rd year in 2 weeks," Raymond said, nodding. "Company I'm working for says they'll probably want to hire me when I graduate, if I don't do anything stupid between now and then." "What firm you interning with?" The question came from a man a few years older than Raymond who had been examining a rifle. "Lambert and Burns." At this reply, the man gave a low whistle. "Best securities firm on Wall Street. They don't hire just anybody, Jim," he said as he transferred the rifle to his left hand and extended his right in greeting. "Tony Kearns. Pleasure meeting you, Mr. Johnson. Anyone Lambert and Burns plans to hire who also likes fine rifles is a man I'd be proud to know." "Well, thank you, sir," Raymond answered, feeling a bit awkward and not knowing quite what else to say. "Are you a lawyer, Mr. Kearns?" Kearns shook his head. "Please, it's Tony. And no, I'm an analyst with White & Veld," he said, naming a good-sized Wall Street brokerage firm. "Risk arbitrage department. Such a huge part of the firm's business they're even thinking about hiring a second person." Kearns grinned. "When you guys draw up merger deals, I look at them after they're made public and try to figure out which company's stock White Veld should buy and which it should short. If any," he added as an afterthought. "Huh. If you're looking at merger deals, they haven't been drawn up by me, Tony. All summer I've been nothing but a research flunky, and that's all," Raymond said, wanting to change the subject. "What's that?" he asked, indicating the rifle in Tony Kearns' hand. "Tony is one of our rather eccentric customers," the proprietor broke in, feigning a pained expression. "Despite our worldwide reputation for building graceful, perfectly balanced rifles on Springfield, Mauser, and Model 70 actions, Tony will have none of them. He is only interested in rifles built on the big, clunky old Enfield." He said the last word as if it were heresy to do so. "Jim here is getting old, Ray, and he's too weak to hold up or carry a rifle unless it's a featherweight," Kearns explained with an attempt at a straight face. "His brittle old bones can't take any more recoil than a .270 produces, which is why he'll never go hunt something that might eat him." The man laughed. "Ray, Mr. Kearns here has taken more mental safaris to Africa than any other person on Earth." "Oh, I wouldn't be too sure about that," thought Raymond. "What caliber is it?" Ray asked, indicating the big rifle. "450 Ashurst," Kearns said immediately. "Full-length 375 H&H case, necked up to .458 caliber and blown out straight. Holds more powder than the .458 Winchester Magnum, but only if you've got an action with a long magazine. In a Model 70, a Springfield, or a Mauser, you can't seat the bullets out far enough to use all the powder capacity of the case. The receiver's too damn short. That's why I like Enfields. They'll handle real cartridges. And you'll notice that despite our host's irrational infatuation with lesser weapons, his gunsmiths managed to do quite a fine job with one of these clunky old World War I relics." He handed the younger man the rifle. Raymond saw that quite a bit of effort had been expended to turn the military action into a worthy basis for a fine hunting rifle. The ugly ears, quote-unquote, on the receiver's bridge had been milled off. The dogleg bolt handle had been replaced with a straight one, and the utilitarian trigger guard and floor plate had been replaced with a beautifully handcrafted unit milled out of a single piece of steel. All the metal parts had been carefully polished and finished in the deep rust blue for which Griffin and Howe was known. The stock was dense black walnut, with straight grain through the grip and finely checkered in a traditional pattern. He continued to examine the rifle. "What about a Mag Mauser, if you like big calibers?" Raymond asked. "They make into a decent rifle, but actions alone are hard to come by. You can still buy a French Brevex, but I've always been a little leery of the frogs when it comes to steel and heat-treating methods for high-pressure cartridges. Any German Mag Mauser action you find is apt to be a complete rifle built up by one of the English makers." The Brits do damn fine work, but they aren't big on some of our magazine calibers, and their ideas of how a bolt-action should be stocked differ a bit from my own. They do a beautiful stocking job on double rifles, though," he added. "But big double rifles are out of my price range right now, I'm afraid." Anyway, I'd hate to buy a Rigby and then throw away the stock and barrel. Also, an Enfield has a true 5-degree interrupted thread for its locking lugs. A dinged case or a bit of dirt won't stop you from camming that bolt closed, which makes for peace of mind if you're in Africa. Jim's right. I've never been there, but by God I'm going to, one of these days. So am I. I've been dreaming about it for over 10 years. Then you understand, Tony Kearns said immediately. When I go, I'm going to be carrying a rifle like this one, built on an Enfield, one that will hold 5 or 6 rounds of something with some real steam behind it, like a .475 Ackley, or maybe even that 50 caliber John Buchmiller came up with on that .460 Weatherby case. Ray Johnson heard this last statement from his new friend, but he was thinking about his .600 Holland double rifle, and Tony Kearns' words didn't register at the time. He would recall them 20 years later after a particularly harrowing experience, and would take them to heart. Tony Kearns had no inkling that the words he had just spoken would one day prolong the lives of several people. Ray Johnson's would be one of them. New chapter here. Page 110 here. Chapter 41. The story of Billy Dell pulling a Paul Bunyan. April 6th, 1963. A Buick Riviera pulled into the driveway. The car was unfamiliar, but the driver was not. Henry Bowman had just put his clothes on after getting out of bed on the sunny Sunday morning. He ran out the back door to greet his Uncle Max. "You like it? Picked this up half an hour ago," Max Collins said as he leaned against the gleaming blue coupe. "And I thought I'd see if you wanted to go for a ride. Your mother said your dad had a teachers' meeting first thing today and couldn't be home. Want to go get a hamburger and breakfast at Steak and Shake, then go shoot your rifle some? I got a place where you might be able to try what you were talking about the other day." Henry's grin was all the reply Max needed. "Can we? I'll go tell Mom," Henry said as he ran back in the house to get his Winchester, shooting glasses, earplugs, and ammunition. "Highway 40 used to end here at Brentwood," Max Collins said to his nephew as they sat in the parked car and chewed on their hamburgers. "They didn't extend it east until about the time you were born." Max rested the hand that held the hamburger on the bottom rim of the steering wheel. The smell of the freshly cooked meat mingled with the Buick's new car smell. It was a pleasant combination. "Back in 1948 and 49, a kid from the West End used to hang out in this parking lot looking for races. Went by the name Billy Dell. He had a Model 88 Oldsmobile, just like your dad drove. You know, the one with the rocket V8 engine that would run like a stripe-assed ape, only Dell's was black. Used to get races lined up right here in this here parking lot. After he and whoever he was going to race had decided what they'd run for, he said, gesturing out the side window, they'd get on that entrance ramp right there and park for a couple of minutes, blocking it. That was the only way to get on Highway 40, and it pissed off whoever was right behind him, but it made for a clear stretch of highway to race on. Now there was this one cop, a highway patrolman who made it his mission to nail Billy Dell. Waited him out one Saturday afternoon about a half-mile up the highway. That black Olds went whistling by, and the cop lit out after him, but he never could catch up. Billy was more careful after that, and he'd make a slow pass down the highway before coming back here and giving the all-clear. Did the policeman ever catch him? Henry was fascinated by this story. No, they didn't. And he did something he shouldn't have. The kid lived with his parents, you see, down on Kingsbury near where your cousin Ruth has a house. He kept his hot rod in a locked garage whenever he wasn't driving it. Billy raced for money, and he didn't want anyone doing anything to his car when he wasn't looking. He even put a padlock on the hood. But you see, the police know how to get into locked places without keys. One night, the state patrolman picked the lock on the garage and picked the lock on the hood. What did he do? Well, he wanted to do something that would ruin the engine. He could have put sugar or something like that in the gas tank, but that would just gunk it up. The kid would have to take it apart and clean it, but then the engine would be back to normal. The cop didn't want that to happen. So what he did was, he took off the air cleaner so he could get at the carburetor. That's the thing that lets air and fuel mix in the engine. And he dumped a handful of hardened steel ball bearings down into the carburetor. Then he worked the throttle linkage with his hand and opened the carb, like would happen if you stepped on the gas pedal. Then let the ball bearings go through the carb and into the intake manifold. You couldn't see them anymore, even with the air cleaner off. Then he put the air cleaner back on, locked the hood, and locked the garage door behind him. The next morning, Dell got in and fired up his car, and there must have been a god-awful noise. Before he could shut it off, the motor seized up and quit. When he disassembled the engine, all kinds of stuff was broken. Bent valves, cracked pistons, a crack in one cylinder head, and a lot of other stuff I can't remember. How did you find out about it, Uncle Max? Hell, everyone in Missouri knew about it. Came out at the kid's trial. You see, the cop couldn't resist telling one of his buddies on the patrol about what he'd done. Word got out to the whole troop station. There are a few guys on the patrol, or at least there were back then, that don't much believe in giving speeding tickets at all. One of them must have thought vandalizing a citizen's car was dirty pool, because one way or another, someone told Billy Dell what had happened. What did he do? For a long time, nothing. He found out what the trooper's routine was, though. One night, when the trooper was out cruising I-40, the kid was on one of those bridges about 10 miles west of here, waiting for him. A week before, he'd painted little white spots on the shoulder that were different distances from where he stood on the bridge, and he had practiced dropping small pebbles from the bridge when cars got going different speeds past those marks. See, he was figuring out exactly when he'd have to drop something so that it would hit a car, not land in front of or behind it. When he was practicing, he dropped the pebbles at the side of the road. He didn't want to ding up anyone else's car. But he paid close attention to where the car was when the pebbles hit the ground. What did he drop on the police car? A big rock? What did he drop on the police car? A big rock? Henry went to a school that pushed learning very hard, and he knew that heavy objects fell at the same rate as light ones if air resistance was not a major factor. No. A 200-pound oak log. A log? Yep, that's right. And it hit the hood of the patrol car and smashed the windshield. The side pillar, this thing here, Max said, pointing to the left side of the Buick's windshield, kept it from going all the way into the car and killing the cop. But the car went out of control and flipped. Cop broke his back and lost his right eye. He got some feeling back in his legs, but he never walked again. Did the man who dropped the log on him go to jail? Well, you see, they had a big trial, and guys who try to kill cops are usually despised. But then again, so are cops who break into people's homes and vandalize their property. Also, the highway patrol doesn't do any real police work. They mainly just give out traffic tickets. As such, there was a surprising amount of public sympathy for the Dell kid. One of the local car clubs had some decals printed up of Paul Bunyan driving a souped-up Oldsmobile. Then a local cop got pissed off when he saw one on some colored kid's car, and he smashed the driver's window with his nightstick and worked the kid over, right in front of his girlfriend. Put him in the hospital, too. That got another big write-up in the papers. Eventually, the jury did send Dell off to prison at Gumbo for a few years. He's out now, but doesn't live around here. Every now and again, you'll hear someone from this area say he'd like to pull a Paul Bunyan or pull a Billy Dell. That usually means he's mad at some cop that screwed him over. Pull a Paul Bunyan, Henry thought to himself. It's got a nice ring to it. Hell, anyway, she runs pretty good, don't you think? Cuts the wind down, too. The Buick speedometer needle was hovering around 110 miles an hour as they sped through St. Charles County. The 401 cubic inch V8 emitted a healthy roar, but there was surprisingly little wind noise. Henry Bowman had a big grin on his face as he stared out the windshield at the road ahead. Had the dealer pitch the shocks that came on it and put on a set of conies before I picked it up. Had him put in metallic brake shoes and make sure the alignment was dead on, too. Watch this. Max Collins took his hands off the steering wheel and stepped hard on the brake pedal. Henry felt himself thrown forward against his seatbelt as the blue coupe behaved as if the air outside had suddenly become 10 times as dense. Despite the lack of hands at the wheel, the car tracked straight on the 2-lane road as it decelerated. At 15 miles an hour, Max put his hands back on the wheel and his foot back on the accelerator. Aren't you supposed to drive slowly when a car is brand new? To break it in? Henry asked. I've never met a race mechanic yet that agreed with that logic. They've all told me that the way to scuff the rings is to put the engine under load, like accelerating up a steep hill, and the way to seat the valves is to run it flat out. If your engine isn't all the way warmed up, I think you're damaging it, personally. But I've run the bejesus out of every car I've owned, and I never saw an American V8 that didn't act like it was going to last forever, except for maybe that blown Ford One I had in '57. The drive slow for the first 500 miles stuff is so people will get used to how their new car handles before they get too enthusiastic. Also to shake out any loose metal particles in the engine from when they put it together at the factory. Before I picked this one up, I had the mechanic put a magnetic drain plug in the oil pan, drive it 20 miles, and change the oil. He didn't find any metal on the plug, so hell, she's ready to run. He looked over at his nephew. We got about 15 more miles. You want to drive the rest of the way? Hell yeah! Henry exclaimed as his Uncle Max pulled the car over to the side of the road and stopped. The man opened the driver's door and got out while the boy climbed over the console and slid into the driver's seat. A handle at the right adjusts your seat back and forth, Max said, pointing. Couldn't let you do this if this car had a bench seat. I'd be squashed up under the dashboard. Henry slid his seat all the way forward and adjusted his lap belt. He stretched his arms out, looking at the dash and getting a feel for where the controls were, and adjusted the mirrors accordingly. Keep it under 100 indicated, Max said in an expressionless voice. Can you get in trouble if we get caught? The boy asked. Max Collins shook his head. Unlikely. The judge in this county likes to hunt pheasants, and I got him set up at Doc Vyman's place, where we're going today. Max did not mention he had also introduced Doc to the pretty little art student girl Vyman had been screwing twice a week. Anything short of armed robbery, we've got ourselves a free pass. Henry nodded as he dropped the lever into drive, checked his left mirror, and accelerated back onto the road. What's the matter? You got sore feet? Max asked pointedly as he looked at his nephew. Henry was holding the Buick at a steady 62. Get on it some while you still got a smooth road and no traffic. Henry pressed on the accelerator. Not quite enough to make the automatic transmission kick down into second gear, and the blue car smoothly sped up. At 90 miles an hour, the boy eased up on the pedal enough to check the car's acceleration, but not enough to cause it to slow down. The car was holding steady at 90 indicated, and Henry's eyes flicked constantly around the road ahead, scanning for other vehicles, objects in the road, and animals. Max smiled at the boy's technique. You been out flying with your dad much lately? Almost every weekend, Henry replied without taking his eyes off the road. Never did take to being up in an aeroplane the way your dad did. Max took off in the distance ahead. After this right-hand bend, there's a gravel road about a quarter mile up on the right. That's where we're going. Henry eased off on the throttle without releasing it completely, and soon the car was traveling at half its former speed. He checked his mirrors and braked as the gravel road came into view, and pulled off the pavement. Take this till it ends, Max instructed. Less than a mile ahead. The road was well tended without ruts or potholes. Henry drove the car slowly on the loose gravel, slightly to one side so as to keep the car's undercarriage away from the high spot in the center of the road. In a few minutes, the road ended at a group of white wooden buildings which appeared to serve various functions. There were 3 cars parked in front of one of them, and Henry pulled in and stopped next to the one on the end. Grab your gear and bring it in, Max said as he got out of the car and went to open the trunk. Henry retrieved his gun case and shooting gear from the floor of the back seat and got out of the car. The big engine was making soft ticking noises as it cooled in the spring breeze. The boy followed the big man into the wood-framed house. Max! Exclaimed an older man with gray, thinning hair. He had a big smile on his face, and Henry could see that one of his teeth was missing. I haven't seen you in a while. Come to shoot some pheasants, eh? And who are you, big fella? He asked as he peered intently at Henry. One of the older man's eyes was a milky color, and his posture showed the onset of curvature of the spine. His stained clothing was the shade of dried mud. His shirt and pants appeared to have been washed a few hundred times with very caustic soap. He looked like an aging yardman. Henry held out his hand. Henry Bowman, sir. Henry Bowman, sir. My mother is Uncle Max's sister. Uncle Max brought me with him today. Pleasure to meet you, Henry. Doc Vyman. He gave the boy a firm handshake.
But none of that sir or mister shit with me. You can call me Doc, just like everyone else here. I gather that your uncle brings you here today to shoot pheasants? He asked. Max answered for him. Not today, Doc. I need to use your pattern board. Got a Perazzi that seems to be shooting low. Henry here hasn't used a shotgun much, but he's hell on wheels with a rifle. Brought his Winchester 22 along. Your back range free to where he could do a little plinking? Sure, Max, no problem. No one's shooting skeet today. He can have the whole area to himself. Okay. It okay if he uses the low house from the number 7 station? With a rifle? Well, you got that big hill for a backstop if you stay on number 7. Hell, I'm not worried about that. How's he gonna hit even 1 if he's not a shotgun man? Maybe he won't, but I think he'd like to try. Well, shit. I'll come run the thrower for him myself. Be a sorry thing to have your nephew hit a clay bird with his rifle and me not see it. He chuckled at the thought. Henry, you go with Doc out to the skeet range. Doc, after I go get my things out of my locker, I'll be over behind you at the pattern board to see how much I need to bend the barrel on this thing. You need anything, kid? Glasses? Plugs? He asked his nephew. Henry shook his head and patted the leather belt pouch he wore that contained his ammo, shooting glasses, and earplugs. Well, okay then. I'll come over and see how you two are doing when I'm all done. Shouldn't be too long. The big man walked into the other room where the members' lockers were. This way, Henry, Doc Vineman said with an inclination of his head. The pair walked outside and headed towards the skeet range. Unlike the Skeet and Trap Club in Bridgetown where Max Collins usually went to shoot clay birds, Doc Vineman's club only had one range for skeet and trap. Few wildfowl clubs in St. Charles County had any. But Doc Vineman, a retired vascular surgeon, had shrewdly realized that many of the wealthy wing shooters had more money than time, and needed some quick practice to tune up their swings a bit before taking the field. The cost of putting in 2 skeet houses and a trap bunker had been minuscule compared to the value of the club's land and the expense and effort required to maintain it. Throwers should be full, Doc opined. I guess you've seen the way they fly. You want to stand at this station here and try to hit low house ones going away? He was indicating the concrete pad a yard away from the opening in the right-hand skeet house, where the shooter would stand with his back to the wooden structure while the clay pigeon was thrown out of the opening and flew directly away from him. I think I'd have the best chance here. This may not work at all. I've never tried it before. Most shotgun ranges don't have a hill to stop a rifle bullet. We were going to use a hand thrower on the riverbank, but Uncle Max was coming out here today and said to bring my rifle. Henry reached into his pouch and took out his shatterproof shooting glasses. Doc Vineman smiled with inward approval. He had retired from surgery when a stray pellet from a hunter in another field had blinded him in his left eye. Since that time, his own shooting glasses were perched on the bridge of his nose, just as they were now whenever he was outdoors. Losing his left eye had cost him his practice. He could not afford to lose the right one. It was something he thought of every day. You hunt much with your 22, Henry? Doc asked the young boy. Almost never, Henry said, shaking his head as he put his earplugs in. Almost all plinking down on the river at my mom and dad's place. I'm pretty good on old golf balls, but since I throw them myself, they're a lot closer and slower moving than a clay pigeon will be. I've shot a few crows in the air, but they fly pretty slow. He gave the scruffy-looking man whose net worth was perhaps $2 million an apologetic look. This might be a waste of your time. Doc Vineman, who had been thinking much the same thing, quickly revised his opinion. As Henry withdrew the semi-auto Winchester from the case, the man noticed that the rear sight had been relocated farther forward on the barrel, to snap-shoot more quickly at close-in targets. He decided this might be interesting after all. He shook his head in reply to the boy's statement. Henry, if it burns powder and goes bang, it's never a waste of time in my book. You want to look at one first? Before Henry could answer the man's question, Doc Vineman pressed the upper right button on the heavy metal box with the black cable running out of it that he held in his hand. A whirring noise came from the wooden structure, and a clay pigeon flew out of it, climbing at a shallow angle as it traveled away from them. Henry watched its trajectory as he withdrew the magazine tube from the Winchester's butt plate and fed cartridges into the gun's loading port by feel, never taking his eyes off the target. Doc Vineman noticed this, and his opinion of the boy's skills went up another notch. It did not occur to Doc Vineman that this skill would one day save Henry Bowman's life. "All set?" Doc asked. Henry stood at the ready next to the opening in the skeet house and nodded assent. "Pull," said the boy, as he snapped the rifle up to his shoulder and loosed a shot at the departing clay pigeon. The flight of the spinning disc continued uninterrupted, despite the crack of the rifle. Henry lowered his rifle to the ready position again. Doc Vineman was surprised to find himself disappointed that the bird had not shattered. "Pull." The second clay bird followed the same path as the first, finally landing at the base of the hill which rose up to the left side of the skeet range. "Pull." Miss. "Pull." Miss. "Pull." Another miss. Henry lowered the rifle, withdrew the magazine tube, and dumped the cartridges into his hand. Then he opened the action and emptied the chamber. The cartridges went back into the leather pouch. He looked at the older man. "The ground's not dry, and I don't think there'd be a fire hazard. Is it okay if I use tracers?" "That's how I first learned on targets in the air," Henry explained. Doc Vineman scowled. 22 tracers? I never heard of them. Henry looked embarrassed. He hated trying to tell adults about things they had never heard of. "They're made in France. I get them from a man in New Jersey named Steen." He reached in the leather pouch, withdrew a white cardboard 50-round box, and held it out for the older man's inspection. The name Gevelot was printed on it in green. "He's the only one I know who imports them. I get a lot of my shooting supplies from him. I don't think he knows I'm 10 years old, though," Henry added as an afterthought. Doc Vineman took the small box in his free hand and poked it open with his thumb. The cartridges looked like ordinary .22s, except that the very tip of each bullet was painted a dull orange. Well, I'll be damned. "How long do they burn?" "About 125 yards. They hurt your barrel any?" "I've shot an awful lot of them, Doc, and I can't see they've done any harm. I always clean the gun the same day when I shoot tracers, though." "Yeah, I figure." "Hell, load 'em up," the man said, handing the box back to the boy. "Let's see where you're shooting, eh?" Henry loaded the rifle with the French ammunition and stood in the ready position. "Pull." The rifle cracked an instant after the butt hit Henry's shoulder, and a burning red dot streaked away from him at about 1,200 feet per second and buried itself in the hillside 90 yards away. Henry saw that his shot was high. "About 8 inches over the top of it. Try another." "Pull." The shot was high again. "You hold on that one the same as the one before?" "Both shots were high the same amount." "Yes, I wanted to see if they'd be the same. You have to get on a lot faster than when you're just tossing golf balls in the air." "Well, they're coming out of the thrower at 45 miles an hour, and you've really only got the edge to shoot at from this angle. Try putting a little daylight under the next bird. Damned if I don't think you're going to bust one in the next few shots." "Pull." The clay pigeon flew out of the hole to Henry's right and sailed on a leftward path away from him. The Winchester cracked, and the burning dot just missed the right edge of the spinning black disc. Just a hair behind it. Elevation looks good. "Pull." As the rifle cracked again, the clay bird broke into several pieces. "Got it!" Doc Vineman yelled. He was surprised to realize he was more excited than the boy. Henry smiled. "Pull." This time the clay bird disintegrated in midair. "Perfect! Christ, you must have nailed it dead center. I never would have thought you could smoke one like that hitting it with just one bullet. God damn, Henry. Max wasn't kidding when he said you were good with a rifle. Keep going." By the time Max Collins finished his work on the pattern board and came over to see how his nephew was doing, Doc Vineman had had to go into the skeet house and refill the thrower with clay pigeons twice. Henry had shot 124 targets and had hit 78 of them. He had switched back to standard ammunition after the 50-round box of tracers was empty. Max stood silently at the back of the range and watched as Henry hit 8 birds with 10 shots. As the boy pulled the magazine tube out of the Winchester's buttstock to reload the rifle, Max walked over to the two of them. "Looks like he's getting the hang of it," Max said dryly. "Max, if you had told me you had a 10-year-old nephew that could run over 50% at skeet with a rifle, I'd have called you a damn liar. How long you been shooting, Henry?" Doc asked the boy. 2.5 years, Doc." "May I?" Doc asked, indicating the rifle. "Sure," Henry replied, and handed the older man the gun. "Magazine's full, chamber's empty." Doc Vineman nodded and examined the weapon carefully. "Any idea how many rounds you've put through it?" It was obvious the rifle had seen considerable use. I'm on my 14th case of regular ammo and just finished my 4th case of tracers. I don't know how much the first owner shot it, but it looked about the same as it does now when I got it. It's over 20 years old. 90,000 rounds! Doc exclaimed, having done the multiplication. Has anything broken on it? The retired surgeon looked at the rifle with renewed respect. I've broken 5 or 6 firing pins, but that's from when the hammer falls on an empty chamber. I normally count shots and know when it's empty. But, you can't do that when it's shooting rapid fire. Henry looked uncomfortable for the first time that day. His uncle grinned at him. Go ahead, Henry. Show Doc. He won't mind. The boy looked unconvinced. Max saw the look and went on. He'll get a kick out of it. Come on, show him. Henry Bowman shrugged, took his rifle back from their host, and worked the action, chambering the first round. This time he did not hold the rifle at his waist, but instead put it up to his shoulder. He also shifted his grip slightly and deliberately inserted his trigger finger into the Winchester's trigger guard. Pull! When the clay pigeon was about 30 yards away, a staccato noise erupted from the rifle, and the clay bird vanished in a cloud of black dust. Doc Vineman's jaw dropped, and Max Collins started laughing. Henry opened the action to make sure the rifle was empty, and gripped the rifle's takedown screw between the thumb and forefinger of his right hand. After loosening it, he pulled the buttstock off the receiver and carefully laid the barreled action in the grass. He held the buttstock and trigger mechanism up so that the older man could see it, and reached into his pouch, withdrawing a small screwdriver. On a Winchester 63, the sear has an egg-shaped hole in it that lets it rock back and forth, under spring tension on this pin. He pointed with the blade of the screwdriver to the parts he had just described. If the gun gets really dirty and that hole gets clogged up, or if you stick a paper match in the hole and break it off, he added mentally, the sear will stay down when you pull the trigger. That can happen on most semi-auto 22s, and usually the hammer follows the bolt down on the second cartridge and the gun misfires after the first shot. That's because the hammer is moving more slowly and is cushioned by the bolt, and it doesn't have enough power to set off the primer. Henry swallowed and then continued. On a Winchester Model 63, though, the hammer is much bigger and heavier than on other 22 autos. He pointed to the internal hammer with the screwdriver. Even though it's slowed down, it's still got enough force to fire the next cartridge, so the gun goes full auto, like you just saw. But it wasn't doing it before, and your rifle doesn't look like it's all that dirty yet, Doc protested. Henry Bowman looked self-conscious and was about to reply, but Max cut in. Henry figured out how to hold the gun in a certain way so that when the action cycles upon firing, the sear gets bounced out of the way of the engagement notch just from the internal harmonics of the operating mechanism. Bump fire, they call it. The boy reattached the buttstock to the rifle and held the weapon with its left side facing up. If you push your trigger finger all the way through the trigger guard so that you're pulling the trigger with the second finger joint, like this, he demonstrated, then the tip of your trigger finger will be pressed against the left side of the receiver. That seems to transfer some of the shock of the bolt to the rear and bounces it out of the way. At least, that's what I think is happening. Do all Model 63s do this, or just this one? Doc asked incredulously. I've only tried 3 others, but they all did it just like mine. They don't do it as reliably if you try it left-handed, he added as an afterthought. Henry can dump the whole magazine onto a playing card at 10 yards from the hip, Max said proudly. That's using a sling, Henry explained quickly. Even a 22 on full auto will climb because they cycle so fast. I loop a long sling over my shoulder from the barrel to the buttstock and push down on the gun with both hands before firing. He demonstrated by holding the rifle as he had described. With a sling, you can really keep them close together. With tracers, it looks like a laser beam. You've seen a laser? Doc Vineman demanded. This day was proving to be full of surprises. Just one in a magazine, Henry admitted sheepishly. All 3 laughed at that. It looked to me like it was getting too easy for you, Max said, changing the subject. Let's see what you can do from the next station over. Henry moved a few yards to the left and slightly back and stood on the concrete pad of Station 6. He withdrew the magazine tube and loaded the rifle with 10 cartridges. Pull. Henry swung on the bird and missed. This is going to be a lot harder, he said pointedly. I wish I had more tracers with me, but that was the last box I had left. On the 8th shot, Henry connected, and a big smile crossed his face. Okay, I think I got the lead figured out. He broke 7 of the next 12 clay pigeons. Want to try Station 5? Doc asked. Okay. Henry walked to the next pad over. He was in a position where the birds were flying much more from right to left than before, and were farther away from him to begin with when they emerged from the skeet house. This time it took 14 shots before Henry connected. Out of the next 44 birds, Henry broke 7. I'm out, he said finally, opening the rifle's action to make sure it was indeed empty. I'm going to have to do a lot more practicing if I'm ever going to get any good at the middle sections. He walked over to retrieve his rifle case and slid the Winchester into it. Max, you bring your nephew out here any time he wants to come. I'll make sure someone runs the machine for him if I can't do it myself. The 3 of them started walking back towards the clubhouse. Henry, how did you get interested in shooting aerial targets with your rifle? Doc asked the boy. 4 years ago, Uncle Max gave me a copy of Ed McGivern's book on shooting things in the air with a revolver. As soon as I got my rifle, I started trying to hit things in the air with it. After my dad put the rear sight farther forward on the barrel, it got a lot easier. Doc Weinman pulled the screen door to the clubhouse open and held it for his guests. You do any shooting with a revolver? Henry shook his head. This Winchester's the only gun I own. You sure as hell know how to use it. Would you like to try a revolver? I've got one I haven't shot in quite a while. Yes, thank you, Henry said immediately. Then his face fell. But I'm out of ammo. I may have some here. Just wait a minute. Doc Weinman went into the other room. Henry and Max could hear him opening drawers and rummaging through them. In a few minutes he returned with a brown cardboard box and handed it to the boy. Henry lifted the lid and took out the blued Smith & Wesson Model 17. He pressed the cylinder latch forward and swung the cylinder out to make sure the gun was unloaded. He aimed the revolver at a spot on the top of the opposite wall, sighting along the 6-inch barrel. I was mistaken about the ammo. Thought I had some 22s here, but I don't. You take that K-22 on home and see how it shoots for you. Henry gave Doc Weinman a worried look, but the older man shook his head. I don't think I've put a box of shells through that thing in 5 years. It's just been sitting in my desk drawer. Shooting won't hurt it, and I can see you take good care of your guns. Come back with it next time and show me what you can do. The grips look a little big for his hands, Max broke in. I think I've got some smaller ones that fit a K-frame Smith back at my house. You want to sell that gun, Doc? Doc Weinman waved the question away. Let's see if he likes it first. He may decide he wants a shorter barrel or something lighter like the Smith kit gun built on the J-frame. Thanks, Doc, Henry said earnestly as he and his uncle turned towards the door of the clubhouse. Elsewhere, Afternoon, Mr. Guetterez. How are you? Piedro Guetterez looked startled at the question, and at being addressed in such a formal manner. Piedro had never talked to a lawyer before, and now he had been hailed by Mr. Raymond Johnson, who rented an apartment in the New York building where Piedro worked as a maintenance man. Raymond Johnson was the only lawyer he had ever spoken to in his life, and he was surprised that the young man knew his name. He was about to give the standard 1 or 2 word reply and walk past when he saw the look of genuine goodwill on Raymond Johnson's face. Ray smiled easily at the nervous man. Piedro reminded him of one of the ranch hands his father and uncle had employed for a few years while Ray was still in high school. A lot of the men who worked on ranches in Colorado were lean, wiry men of Spanish descent. Raymond was about to say something else to put the man at ease when all of a sudden the older man's face crumpled. He made a visible effort to recover, but the smile he finally put on his face was a ghastly caricature. Horrified, Raymond reached over and put his hand on the smaller man's shoulder. What is it? What's wrong? Piedro Guetterez, like most men, had a definite sense of pride. He had kept his troubles to himself for so long, and the young lawyer's kindness had been so unexpected, however, that words started pouring out of his mouth before he could stop them. It's about my daughter, Mr. Johnson, the man said. My youngest one. She'll be 4 years old next month. I know it is God's will, and I should be strong, but my heart is like a block of lead when I look at her. Ray Johnson was not aware that Piedro Guetterez had a daughter, let alone a sick one. But he had learned a long time before that if he let people talk at their own pace, sooner or later he would find out more than if he made the constant interjections and comments that most people uttered out of habit. Raymond said nothing, but cocked his head and raised an eyebrow to urge the man to continue. She is blind, Mr. Johnson. Blind from birth. But that is not the worst of it. When I was a young boy, I knew a blind girl in our village. A blind daughter would be a child I could show love to and help her as she grew into a woman. He gave a helpless gesture as his words trailed off. But Rosita, my poor Rosita, anguish showed painfully on his face. Raymond Johnson made an immediate decision. In later years, he would wonder if his decision had been brought about by simple compassion or by some kind of sixth sense or premonition. "What time are you done work here today, Mr. Guetterez?" Piedro shook his head. "Today I am off, sir. I came to pick up some things I left in my locker in the basement. Then I am going to go look for part-time work." He looked very ashamed. "We have no money for rent or food, Mr. Johnson." Raymond looked at his watch. "It's well past lunchtime and I haven't eaten either. I was going around the corner to get a sandwich. Why don't you join me? And you can tell me more about it. Sometimes it can help just to talk. You'll be better able to look for more work on a full stomach." Raymond held the door for the older man, who looked startled and embarrassed, but then walked outside. As they sat across from each other in the booth at the cafeteria, Piedro Guetterez ate like he hadn't had a decent meal in a very long time, which of course he hadn't. He explained to Raymond how his younger daughter had been born without eyes or most of her brain. It was the first time he had talked to any Caucasian about his daughter, other than the intern who had delivered her almost 4 years before. "My wife Rosa, she had a very bad time when she was carrying Rosita. Not like that with any of the other 3 that came before. She had bad headaches and became very dizzy. After the baby was born, Rosa did not get better. Finally, she could not work. The company she worked for, they finally had to tell her she had to go. She was still very sick, even 3 years later, and the doctor cannot say why. The priests say it is God's will." "It sounds like there's something seriously wrong with the mother," Raymond thought. "Who do I know that might have a more accurate diagnosis than the tired intern fresh out of medical school they've no doubt been using?" Ray took a bite of his sandwich and thought about what the older man had said. "Where was she working?" Raymond asked, now just making conversation while he searched his memory for a doctor that might help out the indigent family. "Allied Chemical. She worked there for 3 years. Allied Chemical? Raymond was no longer thinking of doctors. He was somewhat familiar with the firm that Piedro Guetterez had named. The German multinational firm of Becker AG was currently negotiating to acquire Allied. Lambert Burns, where Raymond was an associate, had hoped to get the Allied account, but had been aced out by their main competitor for the business. "What did she do there?" Raymond asked. "At first she cleaned offices in the administration building. Then, right after we learned she was going to have another child, the company found out they were going to have to raise the wages of the cleaning staff. They decided they didn't want to have full-time employees doing cleaning work. It would be cheaper for them to hire an outside cleaning company." He stared at the lawyer. "An outside company that is not nearly so concerned as Allied Chemical about whether its workers are legally in the country." He took a deep breath and went on. "My Rosa and many of the other cleaning women offered to work for the same wages as they had been getting, for they needed the jobs. And Allied had been a good company to work for. The company said that was illegal. It would violate the government's minimum wage law." Guetterez gave a snort of disgust. "The government promises it is going to get higher pay for workers like Rosa, but instead it makes them lose their jobs. They said there were 2 openings for work in the plant. The personnel director said they normally didn't hire women because of the lifting involved, but one of the 2 jobs didn't require any strength, and he said they could take on the cleaning women for that job. Everyone who had been on the cleaning staff more than 2 years put her name on a piece of paper, and the plant manager drew one slip out of a hat." He nodded his hands together as he continued. "With the 4th one on the way and Christmas coming, we couldn't afford to have her lose the job. God listened to her prayers, and Rosita's name was the one that the man picked. How many months pregnant was she when she switched to working in the plant? A little more than a month, I think." "Did Allied Chemical know she was pregnant when they accepted her for the new job?" "Yes," Guetterez said, nodding. "I know they did because she told them about it and asked about maternity leave in the future, and that was when they told her the whole cleaning staff was going to be laid off." "Mr. Guetterez, do you think it's possible your wife was exposed to something in the chemical plant that made her sick and caused the birth defects in your daughter?" Raymond asked. Piedro Guetterez's eyes widened. "But she never handled any chemicals. She only did inventory work, and no one else there ever got sick. "No, it's not possible," he said with finality. "Did her clothes ever smell of chemicals when she came home from work?" "Yes, always." "Did the company issue her a respirator? A mask to filter the air she breathed when she worked in the plant?" "She never mentioned one, no." "Did your wife ever mention whether or not there were any other pregnant women working in the plant, or women who had been pregnant at any time when they worked there?" "I don't think so, no." "Mr. Guetterez, I think it is entirely possible that the chemicals in the air your wife breathed every day at work while she was pregnant may be responsible for her present condition and the fact that your daughter is blind and has brain damage. If that is the case, you have an actionable claim against Allied Chemical, and it is my advice that you retain a lawyer and file a personal injury suit against the company for damages."
Pedro Guetterez was thunderstruck. But the priest said it was God's will. Children are born every day that have such defects. That may be true, Mr. Guetterez, but the mothers of those children don't usually get sick during pregnancy and then stay sick for 4 years after giving birth. And with all due respect, it doesn't matter what your priest says. It matters what a jury says. We don't even have enough money to pay our electric bill right now. Pedro said with guilt in his voice. There is simply no way to pay a lawyer, as you suggest. In personal injury cases, the lawyer typically gets paid only if they win the case. If that happens, they keep 1/3 of the cash settlement and you get the other 2/3. Raymond saw that this news startled his guest. You are right that a woman feeling dizzy and sick and a child with brain damage may not be enough to convince a jury that Allied Chemical did anything wrong. On the other hand, they might award you enough money to get long-term care for both your wife and your daughter. And it might never even get to trial, Raymond was thinking. Becker AG isn't apt to want to buy a company with this kind of lawsuit pending. You might get a quick settlement out of court. Lambert Burns does securities law, contracts between companies. I can refer you to good law firms that deal exclusively in personal injury cases, if you would like. Pedro Guetterez was overwhelmed at the way pouring out his troubles had turned into a discussion of suing Allied Chemical for a large sum of money. In spite of this, he made a decision. Mr. Johnson, I don't want to go talk to another lawyer. I want you to be my lawyer on this thing. Will you do that for me? Mr. Guetterez, you have to realize that what I do all day is write and review contracts between public companies that do business with each other. Furthermore, it was less than 1 year ago that the state of New York authorized me to practice any kind of law at all. I would be breaking my oath under the law if I were to tell you that I was the best lawyer to handle a personal injury case like yours. I'm not, pure and simple. Since a personal injury specialist will not charge you anything up front, I can't claim to be less expensive either. From what you have told me, I think you have a case against Allied Chemical for your wife's illness and your daughter's blindness and brain damage. Let me give you the name of a man to call who will do a good job for you. You can give it to me, but I will not call him, Mr. Johnson. If you think the case is good, then you must believe you can win it. I want you to be my lawyer. He stuck out his hand for Raymond to shake in agreement. Raymond took it, then stood up. I have to get going. We'll talk more after I've discussed it with my partners in the firm. I can't promise you anything until I get their go-ahead. Pedro Guetterez nodded and smiled for the first time in weeks. Back with the Bowman clan, I think we can do better than that, Walter Bowman said as he looked at the Smith & Wesson with the smaller grips. Those don't feel too good, do they? Not really, Henry admitted, gripping the revolver in his right hand. They need more wood in front, like the bigger ones, but not so big on the bottom. I think I have an idea. Walter Bowman left his workbench and started rummaging through a box on one of the shelves in the workshop. He pulled out something wrapped in wax paper and set it on the workbench. Then, using a small screwdriver, he removed the walnut grips from the revolver and laid the weapon on a piece of 3/8-inch plywood. He carefully traced the outline of the frame on the wood using a pencil, then took the pattern over to the scroll saw and cut out the shape. Walter unwrapped the waxed paper to reveal a chunk of modeling clay, which he sliced in half with his pocket knife and pressed around the wooden mock-up of the revolver's frame. He trimmed the excess off the back of the dummy frame and handed the result to his son. Hold it like you would the real one, and work your fingers into the clay. Use your other hand if you need to. Get it to where it fits your hand exactly. Henry spent a few moments molding the clay to where it fit into his palm and fingers comfortably.
He handed the wood and clay back to his father. Walter inspected it carefully. I think I can duplicate this shape pretty closely in walnut. Do you think that would be better than either of these standard grips? Much better. Well, okay then. You go up and see if your mother needs any help with dinner, and I should be able to get these roughed out before the food's ready. We ought to be able to finish them by tomorrow morning. I'll inlet them with the router and get them rough shaped, and I'll let you do the final handwork with the rasp and sandpaper. That sound good? Henry beamed at his father. He loved working on projects with him. Can we shoot it tomorrow? I can't think of any reason why not, Walter Bowman said with a big smile. The boy ran up the stairs to see if his mother needed anything, but his mind was not on dinner. Henry was thinking about how he intended to reread as much of the McGivern book as possible before the following morning. New scene here. Joe Hammond rolled over and fumbled for the telephone receiver. Hello? He mumbled. Governor's office calling. Is this Joe Hammond? Yes, it is. He sat up with a start. Please hold. Joe? Joe, is that you? Yes, Governor. What can I do for you today? As if I don't already know, Hammond thought cynically. Joe, I won't waste words. We need your vote on House Bill 310. It's a close one, but I think that with your vote and a couple others I believe we can get, it will go through. You were in construction, and you know full well how important a new bridge can be to a community that's growing and finding its roads barely able to cope with increased traffic. Jackson County needs that bridge, and the state has an obligation to see that it gets built. I didn't realize it was that important to you, Governor. You're goddamn right I was in construction, Hammond thought, and I realize exactly how important it is to you, you grinning, pardon-selling mushmouth. Your wife's ne'er-do-well brother-in-law owns the land where that bridge is going to be built, and the price the state is going to pay for it will make him a very rich man. By putting the bridge 100 yards east, you could save the taxpayers almost $1 million, and I know damn well that the firm lined up to do the concrete work is owned by your lawyer's cousin. He'll use non-union labor, which is fine, but he'll charge double what I could get the union boys to do it for. And 5-to-1 he goes light on the mix and pays off the engineering firm that'll be testing the casting samples. Bloody thing'll fall over with the first earthquake. I always take a strong interest in the growth of our state, sir. Does he think I'm a fucking idiot? Or does he realize I know the score and just expect me to play ball with him? Hammond wondered. He had not been in the legislature long enough to be able to always read all the other politicians accurately, even one as normally transparent as the governor. Governor, I'm flattered you remember my construction background, but the fact is that I haven't had a chance to look into the guts of this deal and make up my mind on it as yet. Joe, would it save you any time and trouble if I just told you that it was very important to me and that I won't forget your support on this bill? There it is. Out in the open. No more dancing around. Pure bribery. Hammond took a deep breath. If you put it that way, Governor, then yes, you've got my vote. Thanks, Joe. I won't forget you on this one. The governor broke the connection. You're fucking right you won't, thought Joe Hammond as he hung up the telephone. New chapter here. Here on page 121, this concludes Chapter 41, The Story of Billy Dell Pulling a Paul Bunyan, April 6, 1963. Chapter 42, Target Practice, Down by the River, April 7, 1963, will begin on page 122 in the following video of this series. Thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful evening. Auf Wiedersehen.